Hello, I'm Brenda Allison, a bookseller at Barnes & Noble, and today I am so excited to be in conversation with award-winning author Jennifer Haigh. You may know her from her debut novel, Mrs. Kimball, which I bought on a whim in the early aughts and still remember reading, or her most recent novel, Mercy Street, which was a New Yorker Best Book of 2022 and won the 2023 Mark Twain American Voice in Literature Award. Or maybe this is your first encounter with Jennifer's work, to which I say I am very excited for you because you are in for a treat. Today, we're going to discuss her new novel, Rabbit Moon. Rabbit Moon is out now and is the Barnes & Noble April Book Club selection. It's a story of family, secrets, and Shanghai. It is so rich, complex, and full of very real characters, and I can't wait to talk about it. Jennifer, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me, Brenda.
So we're going to this is going to be tough, have a spoiler-free conversation today. So let's get underway. Rabbit Moon is, like I said, a story of family, place, fate, secrets. I would love if you would just give us a synopsis of the novel.
Okay. So Rabbit Moon is a novel I never intended to write. I completely backed into writing this book. What happened was I was working on another novel, Mercy Street, when I got a fellowship to go be in China for 3 months. And I had never traveled in Asia at all before. And here I had this chance to be in Shanghai, fascinating city. So I went there with the intention of working on Mercy Street, and I quickly found that this was impossible. I could not conjure up Boston, Massachusetts while in Shanghai, and I really didn't want to. I wanted to be where I was and fully experience this city. So I ended up writing another story set in that place. Shanghai is a story about an American family that kind of faces its past when a disastrous accident happens to their adult daughter. Lindsay Litvak is 22. She has dropped out of college and has gone to teach English for a year in China. And while she is there, her divorced parents back in Boston get word that she's been hit by a hit-and-run driver. And this is a couple who has been divorced for about 5 years. They've never been in the same room since the divorce. They're completely unprepared to deal with each other. And yet their adult daughter is in danger. So they both do what any parent would do. They get on a plane and fly to Shanghai. So it's a novel about these ex-spouses confronting each other, about them confronting everything that has gone wrong in their family, and also their fears for what's going to happen to their daughter. So it's a serious accident. This is not a spoiler because it literally happens on page 1.
Yep.
This girl gets hit by a car. So everything that happens in the novel grows out of that. So it's not only about the present, but it's sort of a forensic examination of what went wrong in this family, and more specifically, what went wrong in the life of this young woman. What led her to flee her family, go to the other side of the world, and live this kind of mysterious life that is completely separate from her parents. She more or less loses touch with them. She only really keeps in close contact with her younger sister, Grace, who's also very important to the story. Grace is 12 years younger than Lindsay. She has been adopted from China. So their sisterhood began when Lindsay went with their mother to the Chinese orphanage to pick up this infant girl that they'd adopted. Lindsay and Grace are extremely close and share much more than Lindsay ever shares with her parents. So she's kind of a character who's off stage in the early part of the novel. She's at summer camp in New Hampshire, filled with anxiety, trying to figure out what has happened to her sister and what her parents are doing in China.
Great. You talked about Shanghai. Let's start there, because it sounds like that's how this journey of this book started for you. Shanghai is a character in this book. I've never been there myself, but I could feel it. I could smell it. Talk about how Shanghai influenced you, how it's a character in the book. Tell me about it.
Well, this novel is different from anything I have ever written, in part because it was written entirely in public spaces. And that was a revelation to me. This is my 8th book. And I never imagined I would be able to write a novel in tea houses and cafes and public parks and restaurants. But that's exactly what I did in this case. And here's why. I'm really good at languages. So if I am traveling somewhere in Europe, I can pick up a lot of the language. I speak French. I have a decent handle on Italian and German. I'm really good at understanding what is being said around me, and it's too distracting for me to write. It's much more
Mm-hmm.
interesting to eavesdrop on people's conversation.
Yep.
Well, in China, there is no danger of me doing that. I found the language completely impenetrable. And in a way, this was freeing because I
Mm.
could be in public spaces, I could be around people, I could observe people, but I didn't have this language coming in distracting me. The language kind of washed over me. So I think when you read the book, you see that this is a novel written in public spaces. There's a lot of observation of what was going on around me at the time I was writing.
And in Shanghai, you talk a lot about all the people, the smog. One thing that I noticed comes up again and again is the old and the new next to one another. The large dance hall is getting another facelift. The temple that was built over 800 years ago, then it was a factory, and they rebuilt it in the 80s. This idea of like destruction and reconstruction, both physically and with the characters.
Mm. Well, part of what I found so interesting and so compelling and strange in a way about Shanghai is that it's not a city that looks backward. It is entirely
Mm-hmm.
focused on the future. I live in Boston, and there is a
Very
plot on
different.
every other building here, telling you which of the founding fathers slept here. So Boston is a city that really fetishizes its past, and Shanghai, which has a very long past, does just the opposite. The entire time I was there, I was struck by how much construction was going on. And
Mm-hmm.
often you'd see these buildings being torn down that looked new to me, but they were
Mm-hmm.
already being torn down, and seemingly overnight another building would pop up in their place. And I wrote this novel largely in 2016 while I was there. And it has occurred to me that if I went back to Shanghai even today, so what, it's 9 years later, I wouldn't recognize anything
Mm.
because that transformation was ongoing even while I was there. It was
Mm-hmm.
kind of disorienting because your landmarks could disappear very quickly. And so there is this it is the city of the future in every way. And I found that really stimulating. I look at the novel now and I realize that it moves at a pace that is completely unlike anything I've ever written. It moves much
Mm-hmm.
faster. It's so accelerated, and it really reflects the accelerated pace of life in that city. And it didn't come from me. It came from the setting, it came from the place, because now I'm at work on something else and I'm back to my old pace. So clearly, I wasn't the one driving the engine there. It was the experience of being in Shanghai and being influenced by that almost on a cellular level. And you see it on the page.
Right. Like it's interesting because the city influences the pace of the book, your writing, my experience of it. It's not a long book, it's less than 300 pages. And I did feel like I was moving quickly and there were so many people in and out. I want to talk a little bit about, that juxtaposition of Shanghai always looking forward. But in this book, we're often looking back and kind of stuck in the past, some of the
Mm.
characters a little bit. Can you talk about that juxtaposition?
Yeah, so this is a story that moves both backwards and forwards. And at the beginning, it's a suspenseful story that you have a lot of questions as a reader. How did these people get where they are? And so
Mm-hmm.
much of the story is concerned with answering those questions. How did this family get where they are? How did Lindsay herself come to make the choices she has made? And as it turns out, she is living a life that is not at all what her parents imagined during her time in China. And you, as a reader, are privy to a lot of things that her parents never do find out about
Mm-hmm.
life in China. So it is kind of a forensic examination of these characters' lives and of their interrelationships of how the family works.
You've used the word forensic a couple times, and I kind of love that. This like unearthing, this research. We even see it in some of the characters. Aaron, who is the father in the story, is always trying to figure out, well, what happened here. I think it's interesting to think about how each person only knows their perspective. But throughout the book, you unearth so much of this. You talked about the beginning of the book. The beginning, there's a great sense of foreboding. You see the red haired girl and the approaching car. And as a reader, I know what's coming. but I hope it's not. And you can feel it, and you feel it in the rest of the book. How did you decide to start that way with this foreboding?
Well, this is somewhat autobiographical. I tend not to write autobiographically, but in this case, during my time in Shanghai, I witnessed an ungodly number of traffic accidents,
Mm-hmm.
fender benders and bike accidents, and cars slamming cars and cars slamming pedestrians, and because it is a very, very crowded city. It's a city of 30 million people. You cannot believe how many people there are, and there are a lot of cars on the road.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a couple of narrow escapes, in fact, during my time as a pedestrian there. And I was sort of dogged by this fear. Well, my God, if I got hit by a car, what would happen? I
Mm.
guess, I guess what would they'd contact the American consulate, maybe. I don't know. They'd find my family, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I guess. So I really started perseverating about these questions. Well, what would happen if I did get hit by a car? And that what if was really the spark that led me to start this story. So when I started writing, that's all I knew, that there's an American woman gets hit by a car. That's where I began, and that's where the story begins. So the rest of it I discovered in the process of writing it, which is fairly typical for me. I never make outlines. I never,
Oh.
no, never. I really discover the story in the process of writing it, and I discover who the characters are in the process of writing about them. So it was as new to me as it is to the reader as I was writing.
You mentioned the characters and kind of discovering them. Let's talk about them. There's the four members of the family that are obviously the center of the story, but there's also side characters that you meet. Johnny, Lindsay's best friend in Shanghai, Peter, Aaron's business partner, May, Dean Farrell. Even these minor characters we meet briefly, they mean something, and we see parts of their inner lives. The super in Lindsay's building, Shen. Let's talk about the characters and how they reveal themselves to you, how they connect, that interconnectedness.
Okay. Well, I think we should start with Lindsay, since she is the first character you meet.
Yeah.
She is the red-haired girl standing by the road looking at her cell phone when a car comes flying around the corner. So she's the first character you meet. She is Aaron and Claire's 22-year-old daughter. She has come to China to teach English. At a certain point, she moved from Beijing to Shanghai without telling her parents. So they're surprised even to learn that she is living there. This is news to them. She lives in an apartment building that is very much modeled on the apartment building where I was living in Shanghai. One thing I found fascinating about this building was that it was a mix of apartments and businesses on every floor. So it was a very tall building, and on every floor there were little businesses and apartments kind of sandwiched between them. And on my floor, there was a hair salon.
Mm-hmm.
And so I put Lindsay's apartment on a floor with a hair salon.
Yep.
And her best friend, Johnny, is a guy who works in that hair salon. And I didn't make that up either. There was a young man working in the hair salon whom I saw all the time. I saw him in the elevator. I saw him outside smoking cigarettes. And he had great style. He was really interesting to look at. He looked like he was in his early 20s. I know
Very
nothing
Johnny.
about him, but he was Johnny. He became Johnny for me. So I had the visual. I knew what this guy looked like. And because I don't speak Chinese, I was in this unusual position of being an observer, but unable to interrogate the people I met. So this leads to a lot of fantasizing, and
Mm-hmm.
I ended up making up an entire life for this young man working in a hair salon. And I will never know if it is in any way similar to his actual life. And in a way, that's better for me
Right.
as a fiction writer. I'm not limited by the actual facts of the story. I can make up my own facts. Similarly, I did a lot of observing of the comings and goings in this building. And I made up stories for who these people were and what they were
Mm-hmm.
doing in the building. And Lindsay's life in Shanghai is very much imagined based on young women I saw in my building. I don't want to give away too much, no spoilers.
Yep.
But I will say that this unique position of being an observer really kind of tweaked my imagination in a way that was new to me.
Mm-hmm.
And on your eighth book, that's hard to come by.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to find fresh eyes. It's really hard not to repeat yourself. And this is a book in which I do not repeat myself in any way because it was entirely new to me. I really was a fish out of water in this situation. It also affected my ability to write about Shanghai, of course. The only way I was able to do it was to write about characters who were like me, who were
Mm,
clueless Americans who found themselves there and had to sort of figure out how things work. So both Lindsay's parents are like me in that they don't speak a word of Chinese. They've never traveled to China before. Here they are, they land in this city. They go to the hospital to find out what condition their daughter is in. They have to navigate the healthcare system,
yep.
which is very different in China than in the United States. They're constantly dealing with this language barrier and this kind of loneliness, deep loneliness and isolation that come from being cut off by language. There's a moment in the book where Claire takes to riding the subway, and she's so lonely. She smiles at babies, hoping the mother
Mm-hmm.
will smile back because she can't talk to anyone. She's
Mm-hmm.
desperately lonely. There's no one there she can talk to except her ex-husband, Aaron, whom she really doesn't want to be talking to, and
Right.
finds herself marooned with quite against her will. So it's a book about the loneliness of travel in a
Yeah,
way.
you did a great job of talking about like the disorientation too. Like
Mm.
they both take these long flights. Claire's flight gets delayed. She's like, how long have I been awake? And like again, you that disorientation of long haul travel, of being in a foreign country, a country where like the alphabet doesn't even look the same. And then married with the disorientation of an abrupt trauma, and they feel similar in a way. And you kind of marry that together. You talk about, kind of the before and after, the moment of before and after. There's a line in the beginning where Claire thinks, this is how it happens. Your life appears to be out about one thing, then the phone rings, and in a single moment is completely and irrevocably about something else. Let's talk about like that idea of the moment before and after.
Yeah. I love that you picked up on that, Brenda, because for me that is so crucial to the way I approach a novel. For me, a novel begins with the moment after which nothing will ever be the same.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of Rabbit Moon, it's very clear what that moment is, right? It's of course this terrible hit and run accident.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, in the backstory, there is also a moment after which nothing will ever be the same. And it's something that happened in Lindsay's past. And I have to give away a little bit of something. I mean, I can't entirely withhold the story. So,
Right.
as a teenager, Lindsay got into a relationship with a much older married man who was a neighbor, a friend of the family.
Mm-hmm.
And she was 16 years old, and she got into a sexual relationship with this much older man. And this was the moment when the train jumped the tracks in Lindsay's life and also in the life of her family.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the kind of forensic, again using that word, examination of what happened to this family, is going back to that moment and how that unfolded, how Lindsay's parents became aware of this, how they responded, what happened next, and then what happened next, and what happened next. When I'm writing a novel, I never think about plot. What I think about
Interesting.
instead is causality. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a very different thing. Plot is something that a writer dreams up and then makes up some characters to act it out. It's kind of like the way little kids play with dolls, that you invent this scenario and then the dolls kind of act it out. And for me, writing a novel is just the opposite. I start with the people and I make one thing happen to them. And then the whole story proceeds from that one thing. You
Mm-hmm.
ask yourself, well, then what happened? And then what happened? And then what happened? And so, really, the only independent choice I'm making is at the very beginning, the first event that I force to happen. And I
Mm-hmm.
decide very carefully what that event is going to be. And then I'm just looking at the causal chain, the consequences of everything that grew out of that one event. And so in the case of Rabbit Moon, it's the hit and run accident in the present story. And in
Mm-hmm.
the past, it is this relationship with this older man.
Mm-hmm. And two, I feel like this is really interesting because I feel like there's so much in Rabbit Moon that's like, okay, well, why did this happen? And then like, and here you're going in the past and in the future. I'll be like, well, this happened because this happened. And, you talk about the relationship Lindsay has as a teenager and then the accident. But there's so many points in the book that are a crossroads, that if things had gone a tiny bit differently, none of these things would have happened. Even how Claire and Aaron end up dating, how they end up adopting Grace from China. There's a great part, maybe 3/4 of the way through the novel. We talk about the part about the chance of meeting someone. You say, statistically speaking, every meeting is improbable. Statistically speaking, that is a hard word to say, y'all. May and Lindsay shouldn't have met anywhere. And yet here they were on a Saturday afternoon in the springtime in Shanghai, sitting one table apart in a tourist bar near the Bund. And I would love for you to talk about all those chance encounters that change the character's life, that change all of our lives. And sometimes we look back and think, oh, wait, that little thing.
Yeah. And it really, I love that you picked up on that passage where Lindsay is visiting Shanghai for the first time. She's living in Beijing at the time, teaching English, living with her American boyfriend, and they decide to come to Shanghai to check it out. And they have a fight in a bar, and her boyfriend storms out, and Lindsay ends up having a conversation with this random Chinese woman sitting next to her that truly changes her life.
Yep.
And there's a passage where I'm kind of thinking about, what if they'd gone into the bar next door? Then what? And Lindsay's boyfriend's life would have turned out exactly the same way. Had they gone into the bar next door, the outcome would have been no different. But for Lindsay, the fact that they randomly chose that bar, it was raining, they had to run inside quickly somewhere to get out of the rain. The fact that they went into that particular bar changed everything for her. And it happens again and again in our lives. I mean, really, if you go back and look at your own history, the number of chance meetings and the number of random intersections and how truly determinative they can be.
Right. It makes me think, like, we're even sitting here today. How did we get here? You and I, like, right? It's interesting to think about. You'll really go down the rabbit hole. You talked a little bit about Aaron and Claire, the parents. They are divorced. They haven't spoken in years. And now they are together on the other side of the world in a very foreign place in a traumatic situation. So can we talk a little bit about their relationship, how they are very different, how they see one another versus like how they really are, which is another theme I see arising in the book again and again. So let's talk about Aaron and Claire.
Well, this is my favorite thing about writing novels is being able to tell the same series of events from different points of view. It's the experience we all have at Thanksgiving dinner with our adult siblings, where you remember something from childhood and nobody remembers it the same way.
Right.
That is just how point of view works. And it's the same thing in fiction. And so in a situation like Aaron and Claire, they lived those same events. They lived through the same divorce. They lived through this traumatic thing that happened to their daughter, but they remember it entirely differently. And I enjoy that as a novelist, kind of examining the ways people recall the same series of events differently. It's the Kurosawa film Rashomon. It's the same thing. Every observer brings something different to what was seen. Aaron and Claire met very young at a college reunion randomly. It was another one of those situations where, Claire was trying to avoid another guy.
Another guy.
She chatted up Aaron because she didn't want to talk to this other guy. It's more chance. It's more randomness.
And that made me think of another thing that I loved about the book. Like, how well do we ever know our parents? How well do we ever know? That was my next line. Like, our children. Like, right. Lindsay has a tattoo. Claire doesn't know what it means, and then how we play out the grievances of the generations before us. Johnny and Lindsay lied to their parents. Claire resented her own mother. Aaron has stories he tells about his parents. Again, I want to talk about this intergenerational pattern we see in at least 3 generations in more than one family in this novel.
Yeah. But, I never set out to write family stories. It's so funny because all my books can be described as family stories.
Absolutely.
That is never my intention at the outset. I always have a character I'm interested in. I make one thing happen to him or her. So it's never about the family initially, but I find it's impossible to write a fully developed character without giving serious thought to where they came from and who raised them. That's just the truth. I mean, you know this yourself. You never really know someone you're dating until you meet the parents. You must meet the
Ooh,
parents.
that's a doozy. Yep.
You know, it's you only get the surface of things until you understand where people came from. And so in the process of developing a novel, I write about the relatives. I write about the characters' grandparents and early
Mm-hmm.
experiences, and I write little biographies of each of the characters. And a lot of this stuff will never make it into the book, and I know it won't, but
Mm-hmm.
it's necessary for me to know these people I'm writing about. When I'm writing a novel, the characters are as real to me as anybody in my own life. You know, I have a brother I'm very close to. He's a year older, so, you know, we grew up as peers.
Yep.
And I think I can predict with reasonable accuracy what he would say or do in any situation.
Mm-hmm.
I know him so well. And that's how I feel about my characters. That's how I need to feel about my characters in order to write about them credibly. So I put them in these situations, but I think about, well, how would Claire think about that? You know, how
Mm-hmm.
what would Aaron's reaction be? It is specific to who the character is, so it's not a series of events I'm dreaming up and forcing them to enact. It's
Mm-hmm.
putting them in situations, and then because I know them so well, trying to guess them being who they are. What would they do? What would they think? What would they say? How would they feel?
To further build on that idea of family, there's also a lot in here. I want to talk about mothers and daughters. I want to talk about siblings. You know, there's a lot of mother and daughter business in the novel. One question I kept asking is like, do we always assume the worst of our mothers? You know, we talked earlier about, you know, the schism in the family that eventually leads to divorce, that leads to Lindsay being in China. And part of it is the story Lindsay tells herself about what happened. And then there's another part where Claire thinks about her own mother and she thinks like, oh, you know, when she becomes a mother, she's like, oh, wait a minute, it was different than how I interpreted it as a child. So I want to talk a little bit about mothers and daughters.
Oh, yes. Well, you know, those relationships are endlessly interesting to me. I'm very
Right.
close to my own mother, and I think a lot about the complexities of mothers and daughters. When I think of myself as a teenager, as a young woman, I was really tough on my mom.
Uh-huh.
I was much more critical of my mother than of my father. Even though looking back on it now, you know, my mother did the lion's share of the parenting. She really gave much more to us as children. I mean, you know, my parents were a little traditional, I guess, and at the time that was not so uncommon. My mother was a terrific parent. My dad was okay. You know,
Mm-hmm.
but when I was a teenager, I was kind of a daddy's girl, and wow, was I tough on my mom. And there's a little bit of that dynamic at work with Lindsay and Claire, and it goes
Yep.
both ways.
Yep.
That's the other thing. Claire is also critical of her daughter, and part of it is she wants Lindsay not to make her mistakes. She wants Lindsay to do better than she did. And this dynamic was present in my own family. My mother was also tougher on me than she was on my brother for kind
Mm-hmm.
of the same reason. You know,
Mm-hmm.
don't repeat my mistakes, do better than I did. Here's what I learned being a young woman, learn from my experience. And of course, I didn't want to learn from her experience. I wanted to learn from my own experience. So it created this kind of tension between me and my mother that did not exist between my mother and my brother.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Litvak family in Rabbit Moon, it plays out a little bit differently because they have two daughters. So with Claire and Lindsay, there is this tension in part because Lindsay really resembles her mother.
Right.
And Claire is very aware of that resemblance, and a lot of her frustrations with herself, she really projects onto Lindsay.
Absolutely.
You know, and
Sounds like motherhood.
right, completely. And with Lindsay's sister Grace, it is different because Grace looks nothing like her parents. She is
Mm-hmm.
adopted. She is Chinese. There is no physical resemblance to kind of trigger this kind of criticism and that Claire feels of Lindsay, which is really self-criticism. With Grace, it's an entirely different ball game. You know, I have a lot of friends and close family members who've adopted daughters from China. So this is something
Mm-hmm.
I've been interested in for a very long time. All the different ways these adoption stories can play out. I mean,
Hmm.
there's no one script. Every family is different, every daughter is different. But a lot of what the book is occupied with is Grace's experience being an adopted daughter, being from a different culture, being of a different race, from the sister she's super close to, and these parents that she loves very much. And what that is experience is like growing up, what it's like for her later. I'm not going to say too much more about that because that is one of the surprises of the novel is
Hmm.
how that all unfolds. But this question of adoption has long been interesting to me, and because there was such a huge number of Chinese infants, almost all girls,
Hmm.
who were adopted by American parents in the 2000s, right around the time Grace was adopted. And there are many, many such stories. And I talked to a lot of people, both adoptive parents and women who were adopted from China, and so got many, many different perspectives on that. So Grace's story is but one iteration of how that
Right.
whole adoption story can play out. One thing that is, I think, fascinating about Grace's story is how extremely close she and Lindsay are. And that's not automatic among siblings, among sisters, adopted
They have
or
a big age gap.
giant
There's
age
that.
difference.
Right.
They're almost two different generations,
Hmm.
and yet they have this kind of unbreakable bond that is really kind of lovely. That even when Lindsay was most estranged from her parents, she never lost touch with Grace. She never turned on Grace. Grace was always the person that she felt was her real family. Grace being far, far away when this accident happens, it's very fraught for her. She's 11 years old. She's at summer camp indefinitely, as it turns out.
Right.
She's at camp when the accident happens. Her parents fly to China, and she's just stuck there
Yep.
and with no way of knowing what's going on. The other thing that is I found very powerful about being in China at the time, and it is still true, is that your technology doesn't work.
Oh, right. Yeah.
There's the Great Firewall, so you can't
They're
use
like, we can't Google it.
right,
Right.
exactly. You can't get Facebook, you can't use
Hmm.
American social media, you can't use any of these means of communication that we are all utterly dependent on,
Hmm.
as it turns out. When Grace is at summer camp, their phones are confiscated.
Right.
And it is so it's such a calamity for her because she has no way to be in touch with her sister Lindsay in China. And up to this point, she and Lindsay are in constant touch. They're texting all day long, all day long. They've done this
Hmm.
Grace's whole life. And now suddenly she has no way to reach her sister.
Right.
She doesn't have an address. Like the idea of writing a letter, which
Oh,
is what
yeah.
they
She's
do.
like, a letter to China is stupid. Doesn't
Yeah,
even exist.
right. She says
Right.
she has the thought it's like writing a letter to the moon.
Right.
So, they're at camp, their phones have been confiscated, and the counselor tells them, oh, well, you can write, you can't text, but you can write letters. And they set aside quiet time for the kids to write letters. And Grace says, this is ridiculous. And she doesn't even have an address to send a letter to because she
Right.
never needed one. They've just been texting her entire life. So that kind of realization that all your technology fails you at this point. Lindsay is in the hospital. She's being treated after this very serious accident. Your first impulse as a parent is, well, let me Google it. Let's
Absolutely.
find out medically what's going on. Well, I'll Google it. I know, I'll Google it.
Right.
You can't Google it.
Right. You can't speak the language. You can't Google it. They're totally lost. They're
Yeah,
totally floating. Right.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
With any of the tools that you would rely on normally in your normal life, none of that is available to you. So yeah, that was and for me, just being in China for 3 months, I felt much further away than I otherwise would have because of technology, not having access to my usual technology.
Interesting. Yeah. Talking about like feeling floaty and unmoored, I want to talk a little bit about faith and how faith and belief plays a role in your other novels and in this one. Aaron and Claire visit a temple, and Claire, talks about her experience with faith, Aaron's experience. I would love to talk a little bit about how the role faith plays in our lives in this novel and your work.
Absolutely. It's one of those subjects I come back to again and again because of my own
Mhm.
background. I went to 12 years of Catholic school,
Same, Jennifer,
12
same.
years,
Yep,
and
12 years.
Yeah.
13 if you count kindergarten. Yeah.
Right, right. And
Yep.
so, I grew up in this family where it was absolutely normal to have a priest at Sunday dinner. So
Mm-hmm.
this was my default setting. This was my upbringing. And so when I write fictional characters, I always must consider their spiritual beliefs, even if they don't have any. And many of my
Mm-hmm.
characters don't.
Right.
But it's not something I don't think about. It's not a detail. It's really important. And in the case of Aaron and Claire, this attitude toward religion was part of the wedge in their marriage. One of the things that never really worked.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Claire is a seeker. She is a person of spiritual hunger. And although she isn't religious per se, she's always looking for meaning. She's looking for something larger.
Mm-hmm.
And Aaron is, he is a scientific thinker. He is absolutely atheist and has been his entire life. He's hostile toward the very idea of religion. And
Mm-hmm.
this is one area where Aaron and Claire never connected. They just never did. And now that they're going through this really, scary, fraught, life-changing catastrophe, what's happened to their daughter, Claire is seeking. It's Claire who
Mm-hmm.
wants to go to the Buddhist temple and pray for Lindsay's well-being. And Aaron kind of gets dragged along on this excursion. And you kind of see in real time how
Yep.
these two people just are wired so differently and their beliefs do not line up at all. So in the course of the novel, you see Claire as a seeker and kind of the conclusions she comes to as the story unfolds. And Aaron sort of doesn't change in that regard. He is nominally Jewish. He's, I guess, sort of culturally Jewish, at
Mm-hmm.
most culturally Jewish. But he's suspicious of the whole idea of faith. And his parents were too. His parents were not believers either. And so this has just never been part of his experience of life or his way of interacting with the world. But it's something that Claire misses and needs. I find myself writing about it again and again. I did a whole novel called Faith.
Right.
It's a book that is focuses on a Catholic priest in the Boston Archdiocese where I live, who is accused of molesting a child in his parish, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a novel told from the point of view of his sister, who is very fond of her brother, but isn't sure whether or not he did this horrible thing, and so it's kind of a mystery story. It's the sister trying to get to the bottom of these allegations and understand what really happened.
More forensic investigation.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
precisely.
Yeah.
And these questions of belief, I mean, these cut to who we are as people.
Right. From a kind of heavy topic, there is humor in the book. Again, it starts with this tragedy, but there is humor. Grace is going to a Quaker camp, and you describe it as looking like a penal colony, but priced like a five-star resort, which really cracked me up. And, there's a moment where Claire gets to Shanghai and she gets her period, and there's no tampons. Talk about how you interlaced humor in a fairly serious book.
Part of it is that fish out of water experience. Claire looking for tampons is a prime
Oh,
example. They're really hard to find.
did that happen to you?
As it
Yeah.
turns out, yes, they're really, really hard to find. But everything is hard initially because it's just you have these kind of these everyday things that these sort of tasks that you perform every day, going to the drugstore, going to the grocery store, these kind of necessities of living. Well, of course, all these things work differently in a
Right.
different culture. And a lot of the humor in the book comes from seeing Aaron and Claire just try to find their way, try to figure out how things work.
Absolutely. So we're getting ready to wrap up. Is there anything else you would want people to know about this novel that we haven't discussed yet?
Well, I think more than anything, it is I feel this novel was a gift that I was given by this fellowship. It's the gift of travel. There's something
Mm-hmm.
so powerful about looking at the world with fresh eyes. And that is a hard thing to do in familiar surroundings. It's a hard thing to do in your own culture. But wow, being plunked down in, a place that is so unlike anywhere you've ever been, it stimulates your brain in all the best ways. And it lets you look at the world with fresh eyes. And so the writing of this book was that for me. It was looking at a world that was new to me, looking with fresh eyes.
I love that. Thank you. So we are a bookstore. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask you what you are currently reading and loving or one of your all-time favorites.
Oh, I can show you.
She's
So,
prepared.
oh,
Yay. I
so
love
because
it.
because I was reading it right up until the point we started our interview.
So
it's hard
definitely
to put down.
good. Let's talk about it.
It's wonderful. It's not yet published. It will be published in August. It's by the Irish writer Eimear McBride. And the novel is called The City Changes Its Face. It's coming out in August. It is utterly riveting. I can't say enough about it. Highly recommended.
Excellent. I love that. Thank you for the recommendation. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Jenna.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.